I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters, the only weekly, serialized sword and sorcery podcast in all of the sundered worlds. Every episode is not only written by me, but performed, recorded, and produced by me. It's completely DIY. This is the third episode of SKALD's 7th cycle, but you don't have to worry about going back to the previous ones, unless you want to. That's because every episode of SKALD is meant to be an easy entry point for new listeners. So go ahead and dive in here with the best episode yet. Afterward, you can go back to the earlier episodes via podcast or YouTube. You can pick up the prose volumes from Amazon, or you can just wait until next week when there will be a brand new episode waiting for you. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 99. For the first day of the journey, they barely talked, barely spoke at all. A warning of a loose rock, a question of orienteering, or a suggestion of when to make camp for the night. It's all they spoke. It's all they had desire to speak. Because as they marched into the wilderness, as they climbed up into the mountains, both Peer and Gira were furious. Peer knew why Gira was angry. He knew. He had known her long enough to understand, to see through the cold shoulder she was currently giving him, through the curt, overly polite advice she gave them on their march. She was angry that he had spoken up, that he had dared to take action, to make a decision, to be an active member of their partnership. She had expected him to just stand there, mouth hanging open, useless, worse than useless, a waste of space and of breath. She had expected him to stand there and watch as she took care of things. But what happened? What happened? She couldn't take care of things. The plans didn't work, and they were in need of a new option. They had nothing to trade. Lest said that he didn't want anything they had. Except for that. And knowing Gira, she was considering it. She was weighing her options. Peer knew that he had failed her the night before, failed her numerous times, and maybe, no. He shook his head. She wouldn't. She wouldn't ever. And how could he just stand there? How could he just stand there and let that disgusting human garbage speak to her like that? The answer, of course, was that he couldn't. He knew that. She knew that. She knew that he knew it. But still, she had expected him to do what? Expected him to stay silent? To let his sons know that it might have been an option? That it was even on the table? No, absolutely not. Not while Peer drew breath. Not even while his ghost hung about and haunted the weed-filled moors. But she wanted to be the one that made the call. She wanted it to be her decision. She thought that she had earned it, that she, in carrying more than her fair share, was entitled to more of a vote. And Peer had taken it from her, and she thought so little of him that he shouldn't have had a vote at all. That is why Gira was angry, and that was why Peer was angry. Peer was furious. Peer was livid. Peer was so angry he could spit, and worse, he did not know what to do about it. He didn't know how to avenge himself. He didn't know if he should avenge himself. He didn't even know if either of them had truly been in the wrong, really in the wrong. He didn't know anything. And that only made him angrier. So they marched in their fury for an entire day, sharing only the most necessary, the most critical words with one another. They walked in silence. They ate in silence. They laid out their bedrolls and they slept separate, shivering in silence and in spite. And then they woke, they ate, they packed, and they marched once again in silence. And it was on that second day, when he couldn't contain his frustration, could no longer contain his rage, his offense, or his loneliness, that he snapped, that he became unable, incapable of controlling himself, of keeping quiet, while marching behind her, struggling to keep up with her long, powerful strides, the ones that rocketed her up the mountain, while panting, while raging, while aching. He called out, "What? Are we just not going to talk?" She spoke, without looking back, without slowing her pace, and possibly even accelerating it. "We're talking now, Peer." He struggled to catch up with her. "You know what I mean?" And after failing to match her speed, and after failing to hear a response, he continued, "I know why you're so mad." She took a sharp right, stepping to the side to avoid a loose stone. "Be careful there. And I know you do." Pierce struggled to stay quiet, to let the silence sit and grow, to become oppressive enough that Gira was forced to say something. But he waited in vain, because once again, it was Pierre that shattered the silence, launching into what he told himself was a defense, what he wished to be a defense, what he knew was most definitely something else. "I don't know what you expected me to do. You heard him. You saw him. You heard what he said, what he implied. I know you said you'd deal with it, but what was I supposed to do? Just stand there? Just allow that? No, I wouldn't. I won't. I don't want to go chasing some imaginary goat in the mountains. Of course I don't. But what else was I supposed to do?" Gira stopped abruptly and turned suddenly, a look of confusion and anger on her face. "What are you even talking about?" Pierre was getting angrier, incensed at her playing dumb when she was anything but. "You know what I'm talking about. What else was I supposed to do? It was my fault to begin with. What else were we supposed to do besides go marching up here?" She approached him slowly, her expression changing to one of sadness. "You're all turned around, caught up in your head. You're exhausted, my love." Pierre recoiled. He shouted, enraged to be condescended to be talked down to like a child, like an invalid. No, no, don't do that. That's the thing. You think I'm nothing. You think I'm worthless, like I don't get to have a choice, a say, and you're wrong. You are wrong. Gira put her hands to her head, struggling to keep her temper. Pier, I'm not angry at you because you had a say. Pier shook his head, trying to fight back the tears that the adrenaline had pushed up from somewhere deep within him. Of course you are. That's how little you think of me. That's how little. Gira shut her eyes, and she shook her head. I'm not angry because of some stupid, twisted logic of what you think that I might think about you. Pier stepped closer to her, emboldened by his anger. And what then? Why are you so angry? Gira opened her eyes, now filled with the same threat of tears that had possessed Pier's, and she spoke, sadly. Because I didn't want you to come. I don't want you to get hurt. Pier began shaking his head and sputtering. It was the same. It was the same as before. She thinks so little of him. She knows how worthless he is, how useless he is, and she blames him. She resents him. She wanted him to sit at home and try not to ruin anything, to sit behind their big, strong door and hide there, terrified of the outside world. If that's what she thought, then he'd show her. He'd show her first thing in the morning, once light had returned to the forest. And it was then that he noticed that Gira's tear-filled eyes were no longer on him. It was then that he realized that though it was dark, it was not nighttime. At least, not by his count, not by his memory. But before he could respond, before he could wait for Gira's thoughts, her advice, her directions, before he could even look up, he heard a voice like raindrops on water. Humans are not allowed here. Not ever. Pier looked up, and he was treated to a dazzling sight. A blur of light, a buzz of dizzying color that sparkled in the darkness, a blanket of it that hung about the trees above them, a blanket that, though unspeakably heavy, seemed to float in the forest canopy. And as he watched, awestruck, Gira spoke. We aren't here to harm you. The blur began to lessen, the shimmering blanket to thin. A more sizable, more substantive blur began to thicken, began to stand out from the rest. And though the voice seemed to come from all around him, though the air still hung thick with the buzzing of insect wings, Pier could tell that this voice came from the light lavender figure who, with his insect wings still twitching, crouched in the fork of a tree, sitting there, despite the cold, wearing nothing but a skirt of leaves. You mean no harm? The creature laughed and spat. Then why else would you have come? Gira, her tongue, unlike Pier's, remaining untied, spoke quickly. No, that's not us. We're not like that. We're like you. like the wild folk. The small creature roared, and despite its diminutive stature, conjured up a fearsome aspect, one of twitching veins, of striated muscles, and row upon row of tiny, razor-sharp teeth. "You are nothing like us! Nothing!" And Peer knew he was right. They were nothing like them. They were barely even the same species anymore. With the coming of the tyrant, no, with the coming of the ruination, some people were tired. They had had enough. They had reasoned that there was no good in man, that there was no good left in him if ever there was any. And they pledged their allegiance elsewhere. They threw their strength behind the wild places. Here, it was the cold mountain forests, but elsewhere, it was deserts. It was swamps. It was rivers and beaches. It was anywhere. It was everywhere. Anywhere that men and women fled into what few wild places remained, devoting themselves to them, bonding with them, giving up their humanity, but gaining in return so very much more. But we know you. The furious creature continued as the buzzing grew louder. We know why you're here. We know why you've come. You've come to exploit, to defile, to devour, to consume, to sell, and to profit off of this land, off of the world that has already given you so much, too much. Gira tried to interrupt, shouting over the buzzing. "No, please, let me explain." A frigid wind began to whip through the trees. You are a cancer. You are a disease. You are an unnatural virus released upon this world, and we shall banish you from it. Gira, screaming to be heard, continued. "We're like you. Please, believe me. We eat no meat." The creature leapt out into open space, and almost instantly, he rejoined the blur, increasing its speed, increasing its density and its volume. That just means you're no murderer. But here in the forest, in the wild places, sleep began to fall, ripping through the full, lush, incongruously green leaves of the trees there. Here, the punishment for murder and poaching, they are the same. Pierre barely had time to draw his sword, that long, thin, razor-sharp blade, before the wild folk were upon them. Fortunately for him, the wild folk, they were not interested in him. Not yet, at least. No, they had focused their attention on she that had spoken to them. They had focused on Gira, who, with her incredible quickness, with her speed, was ready and waiting with her dual stone throwers. You see? The screeching was all around them now, and it was all Peer and Gira could do not to drop their weapons and cover their ears. You bring tools here, tools of death, tools of destruction, tools with no purpose but misery. Gira screamed into the whirling maelstrom that surrounded them. You chose this path! You wanted this! You could have let us go! And as she screamed, as the sleet stung her face, she pulled the triggers. Again and again, She pulled the triggers, flinging stones into the tornado that threatened to consume them. She looked for patterns. She struggled to find them. And when she did, when she thought she did, she struggled to know them, to understand them, to predict them. And then she pulled the triggers again and again, flinging stones out into the infuriated, murderous screeching that surrounded them. But as the stone throwers were spent, as they were exhausted both of ammunition and of fuel, as they transformed into nothing but hunks of useless, deadened metal, the riotous windstorm began to subside. It began to slow down, began to settle down to the ground around them, now slick and wet with the still falling sleet. As Gira struggled to reload her stone throwers, struggled to use what little time she had to her advantage, Pierre looked around frantically, searching for the bodies, eager to learn how many of Gira's blasts had found their target, how many they had laid to waste, and more importantly, how many were still standing, still flying. Glanced around in a full circle, counting only three of the light lavender winged creatures crawling toward them on all fours, giggling. Three. Only three. That wasn't the number that disturbed him. The number that disturbed him was how many bodies laid upon that forest floor. How many corpses were there being buried by sleet. 0. Gira had fired 6 shots, had emptied both of her stone throwers. For nothing. They had all missed. The wild folk were too fast. Now, with her weapons exhausted, with their options exhausted, they were surrounded. They were trapped by those advancing, giggling creatures. We do not eat meat either, human. The leader, the one that had spoken earlier, once again flashed an endless set of tiny, glimmering teeth. But we make exceptions for poachers. Suddenly, Pierre once again found himself surrounded by a blur, an unspeakably fast, glimmering blur, one the speed and the density of which made his eardrums pound. And when it subsided, when his eyes fought through the dazzling light that seemed to reflect endlessly off the sleet-covered trees, he saw Gira lying upon the ground. She wasn't injured. Not yet. The wild folk, they were not so lucky. One of them was also grounded, sprawled out nearby, crawling away from Gira, dragging behind it a broken leg, its delicate shin bones sticking out of its flesh. But that was only one of the 3, and the other 2, they remained unharmed. He that you injured, that you wounded, that you attempted to murder? The leader screeched once again, his voice harmonizing with the falling sleet. He shall eat of you first. And as the leader and his remaining soldiers screeched, as they howled, as they spoke to the primal energies that still pooled in the wild places, they leapt up into the air. And they descended once again. Thanks for listening to the very best episode of SKALD yet. Each week, I read one of my iTunes reviews in an effort to encourage you to go leave one of your own. That's because it's the absolute best way for the show to find new listeners. Jay Kensuke says, "Gather round as the fire burns low. The day is done and the night stretches out. Finish your food and gather round the fire. Pass the jug and imbibe this drink. Let's tell a tale to entertain ourselves before we go back out into the world. This is no fairy tale, no futuristic lore of advanced ages. No, this is the song of a darker time in a world broken and of one man's struggle to reclaim that which had been denied him his entire life. How far would you go to get what you want? When all is taken from you time and time again, when the only thing you can depend on is yourself, could you be the hero of this tale? Listen now to the one true king of men's tale and judge yourself against him to see if you could ever be as determined as he." This episode of SKALD, like every episode of SKALD, is brought to you through the support of my Patreon donors. By going to patreon.com/SKALD, you can help support the only story that matters with as little as a few bucks a month. Plus, by pledging, you get access to a slew of rewards, including 6 brand new ones. For instance, at the $4 level, I'll come up with a personalized fantasy name just for you. It can be for your D&D character, a social media handle, a story you're writing, whatever you want. Plus, at the $4 level, you'll also get included on the show's thank you page, as well as received recommended reading direct from me. Head to patreon.com/SKALD to sign up today. For more information on me, the SKALD Prose volumes, my comic book writing, signed copies of my work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, my bio, contact information, social media, and more, get yourself to aubreysitterson.com. This week's recommendation is, well, non-existent. Normally, I like to recommend a book or a comic or a movie or an album that I've been digging, but I have been so very busy lately that I haven't had any time to consume anything new. That's because I've been busy prioritizing SKALD along with all of my other paying work. Hopefully, things will calm down enough in the next week or so for me to relax and watch a movie or something. So that way, the recommendations can return just in time for next week. And episode 100. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.